entitled this presentation, Influencing for Christ. And we've tried to choose our words wisely here. Our concern really is what's often called evangelism or outreach in the name of Jesus, the spreading of the gospel to those who do not know it. But we've chosen the word influencing because it is in keeping with our overall understanding of the Christian faith and of our work in the living of that out in the everyday processes of life. And we are convinced that it's out of that everyday processes of life that the foundation and basis for evangelism in fact grows. The thing about influence is that it is done by persons. It's also done to persons. And it is something then that must be done in interpersonal ways, which are ways that are in contrast to other things that we could mention. I find it interesting that when we look at the Great Commission, our basic feel under the word influence seems to be emphasized. When you look at Matthew 28 again and read those familiar statements, you can see something of the interpersonal coloring to what Jesus is telling his disciples to do. Go and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them into the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe whatever I have commanded you. And I am always with you, even to the end of the age. Though we don't particularly stop and think about it very often when we read the commission, there are several things within the statements and in the context of that which keep the matter of persons in the center of focal attention. One is the idea of teaching. Teaching is something that we do from one person to another person. Another aspect of this is the idea of name. We are said to be baptized into the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit. There's an identity of person in concern with all of this. And also, Jesus promises to be with us, which fits in very nicely with this understanding of relationship and emphasis on persons. I think it is important for us to notice the commission as something given in a context of the first century, first of all. And I don't know what all went through the apostles' minds, of course, when they heard Jesus say these things as he was about ready to depart from this life. But I can imagine that what is contained here, especially if they were later to reflect upon it, is quite revolutionary and quite contrasting to what they had in their mind as the work of the followers of the Messiah. It's a very well-known thing that the Jews of Jesus' day were anticipating a political Messiah. He was to take part in political work. He was to be a king just as any other king would be. And the people of Israel were to be a political nation. And they were to be in interaction with others. They were supposed to go out and conquer the world. And he was supposed to rule the world through them, centered in Jerusalem. That was their understanding of the kingdom of the Messiah, that was to be universal and eternal. And he was to be permanently with them in that kind of a role. Now, when you stop and think about the political character to their expectancies, and then you read the Great Commission, you see quite a contrast. Jesus is not telling them to go out and involve themselves in a military process. In fact, he's not involving them in any of the kinds of things that are distinctively associated with spreading a political type kingdom. By implication, then, all of those kinds of processes that would be perhaps more natural to a political kingdom are dropped out of the picture when it comes to the way in which we carry forth the power of God in the world through Christ and his people. Other things that are comparable to this, which then are dismissed, are things like intimidation. You sometimes see this used as ways people try to force others into doing what they want them to do. In some places, economic pressures are put upon those who do not believe the things that the leadership of that particular country thinks they ought to believe. Or there is emotional manipulation that people use. Sometimes we try to use social pressure, sort of a high-pressure salesmanship approach. Sometimes these are in fact brought into the way by which the gospel itself is attempted to be spread, but it seems to me that if we look at the character of what Jesus told his disciples to do, then we understand that the basic nature of the whole evangelism enterprise is that of interpersonal relationship and those kinds of processes that are natural to it. Now, this emphasis then upon influence does a couple things for us. One is that it takes away from the professional feel of ministry and those who are involved in spreading the gospel, particularly as a form of ministry. We have a tendency to look upon people that are in that role as specialists. They know more about what they need to do and say and understand and all of that than many of the rest of us do. But if we're talking about influence, we have brought that process into the domain of all persons who can shed influence for Christ. So it is something that opens up the work of evangelism, shall we call it, into the lives of all people. Now, to turn that around the other way, not only does it bring it into the domain of all of us, but it also means that those people who are involved in something of a supported way of ministering cannot allow their private lives and their personal behavior to be set aside when it comes to the work of ministry, evangelism, and so on. The character of the one who bears the message is very much a part of the process of bearing that message, because influence is the thing that is being shed. So, we are going about teaching. We are making disciples. We are not coercing. We are not forcing. We are not doing those kinds of things that would be natural to a political type of situation or any kind of a situation that does not allow those who are to receive the message to maintain their integrity as persons. These other processes dehumanize. They tend to depersonalize. They tend to run over people and make out as if they are, by implication, nothing more than those that are to be manipulated. That's one of the lessons, in fact, that Jesus, I believe, taught his disciples the very night of his betrayal when they were standing there in the garden. Peter draws a sword and he's going to take on the whole group of people that have come out to arrest Jesus. And Jesus stops that right there. This is not the way by which the kingdom is to be brought in. It's not the way by which it is defended. The way by which the kingdom is spread must be in keeping with the kind of kingdom it is. And the way the kingdom is spread must be in keeping with the purpose of the kingdom. The kingdom of God, the kingdom of Christ, is not of this world. Therefore, it is not furthered by distinctively worldly procedures. It is a heavenly kingdom. It is a transcendent kingdom. It's what we could call a spiritual one or an interpersonal one, and so its processes are of that sort. Now, we see this lived out, I think, in the lives of those who came along to do what Jesus commissioned his apostles to do. In the life of Paul, for instance, we see in the second letter that he writes to the Corinthians, chapter 5, verse 11, a little snatch that just kind of gets read right on over the top of unless you happen to be looking for this sort of an idea. It says, we persuade men. And that same kind of an idea comes up in Luke's account of the founding of the Corinthian church. In chapter 18 of the book of Acts, verse 4, it says, Paul reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and sought to persuade Jews and Greeks. In the first letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthians, you have another little turn that he puts to this whole idea of the way in which the ministry he has is to be carried out in his mind. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 2 has the statement, I determined to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. Now, the setting in which the statement is made has to do with the wisdom of men that is tied into then oratorical style and grand rhetoric and all the things that were prized by the ancient Greeks as a way of delivering ideas. Paul says that he didn't come to Corinthians this way, but he came to them not with words of wisdom, but with a demonstration of power. He laid before them a life. He laid before them a way of life. In contrast to all of that, he determined, he says, to know nothing among them except Jesus Christ crucified. It seems to me that it is obvious when we serve one who humbled himself to death, even the kind of a death of crucifixion, there is not much room for pride on our part for whatever contribution we might make to the kingdom that was being founded by such a one. That humility then stands in contrast to things like the pride over the wisdom of words that was so often found among the ancients in this territory. Paul wanted to know nothing except the person of Jesus Christ, and know in the sense, I think, of being related to him and to carrying out his work. Now there is another turn to this as well, and that is that when Paul was in Corinth, he worked as a tent maker to begin that work in the city. And yet in the Corinthian letter he says, I determined to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ crucified. The implication of that seems to me to be that those of us who are tent makers to a great extent, the laymen as we are often called, are people who can live life in the way that Paul meant to live it in the Corinthian situation when he said he was going to know nothing except Jesus Christ crucified in their midst. In other words, then, his whole life, whether a tent maker or the things he did after hours, was going to be characterized in such a way that the message which he demonstrated would be believable to those to whom he demonstrated it. And so when we're talking about influence then, and when we're talking about knowing nothing but Christ crucified, when we're talking about living out the message as the basis for proclaiming it, it says a couple things that are important and leads into the rest of what we're trying to say here. One is that the interpersonal influence emphasis retains the integrity of other people even in the time when they may not yet be followers of Jesus. Furthermore, it requires integrity of us because we are calling upon them to accept something that supposedly we have accepted too. So we want to talk about four things that I believe we can organize the whole matter of shedding influence for Christ into. One is to remove detractors. There's a problem that often exists in ministry. It's addressed in Romans 2:24, for instance. The name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you, Paul says to his Jewish fellow citizens who are living in the city. Peter predicts that in the latter times there will be those who come about living and teaching in such a way as to create the opposite effect of what Christ is trying to do in the world. He says, many will follow their sensual ways, on account of whom the way of truth will be evil spoken of. I have been involved in quite a few churches over the past 15 years or more, working with them in interim ministry times. Often there are problems in the churches. Sometimes they have gotten up to the point where there are 200 or 300, 400 people or more. And then something happens. People do things that they shouldn't do. They say things they shouldn't say. Sometimes ministry does not demonstrate the kind of life it ought to, and those churches melt away and the people leave and go elsewhere. And you come in and you see the remnants of what could have been, perhaps half the size or less of what it was just a year or so before. It's so sad. And I've often thought, wonder what the gospel could do if people would just stay out of the way, if there would be no negative input into the circumstances and into the scene of the church and its work. We're trying to emphasize in this that mission and ministry is not just a profession. It may be that a doctor can do just as good a job of diagnosing a disease and prescribing medicine for it, even if his private life is not what it ought to be. It may be the same thing with a lawyer or someone else who is in a profession. Their private lives are going to affect their work in some ways if those private lives are not what they ought to be. But the distinctive thing of their work may not necessarily be affected to a great extent. But in ministry, in our service, it is absolutely destroyed Because what we are trying to sell is a way of life. If we don't have that way of life, how can we sell it? How can we call anybody to join us in all of that? The primary distinctive of the Christian faith is relationship to God and a living out of a life that is natural for that kind of a relationship. That's the reason salvation needs to be brought, is that people are lost because of separation from God in the first place. There are some areas of importance that we can emphasize here just quickly. Moral matters are obviously things that we all need to remember. Honesty in business dealings is a very important part. It's kind of sad sometimes to go into a Christian businessman's store and to find him doing the same kinds of things you find down the street. It seems as if all things are fair in love and war and business. But if we're going to be Christians and we're going to be in business, then we need to be carrying ourselves in a Christian way in that business. We need to be dependable. There needs to be consistency. In other words, between what we say and what we live in life. We have to have the proper sort of an attitude. Too often people, especially out in the everyday walks of life, get into the win-lose competition, a combative, disrespectful, angry way of living because everybody else around them is carrying on this sort of a way. But if we are going to remove the detractors from our witness, then we're going to have to make sure that the characteristics of the Christian life are ours. Our families also need to exemplify the proper attitudes and so on that are characteristic of faith. And matters of opinion is another big area that we need to remember. A lot of the times we are tempted to invoke our rights because they are, after all, our rights. And we are tempted to invoke our freedoms. We have the right and the freedom to do this. But when we stop and think of the impact of our actions on other people, then if that is our guideline, the primary emphasis is not going to be upon our rights and upon our freedoms. We are not going to just say, well, I didn't mean that. And we don't just go ahead and say things. We stop and think, so to speak, ahead of time to see how they're going to impact on other people. And that's the way of life in general for us. We live it from the viewpoint of those who watch it. It doesn't matter whether there are even moral matters involved. If there are matters of opinion or if there are matters that could be detrimental to our work in influencing for Christ, then we set them aside. We forego our rights. Another thing we could mention here is the way in which we respond to evil. It's awfully easy to respond in kind, especially if it's the matter of being hit by somebody else, so to speak. If we want to influence for Christ, one way we can do it is not to get caught up in the agendas and behavior patterns of other people, even when they are directed toward us. And so we don't have to respond in an evil way to those who act evil toward us. The goal in all of this, I think, is nicely expressed by Paul when he's talking to Timothy in the 2nd chapter, verse 8. He says, "In all things, show yourself an example of good works, so that he who is of the contrary part may be ashamed, having nothing evil to say of us." Now that is a tall order, but at least when we set up a goal like that for ourselves, we bring our own life into conformity with what we're trying to call other people to. A thing we need to say in all of this is that we don't want to be satisfied now with just not adding new negative things to the world and to our community and so on like that. We need to do positive things. And so our second emphasis here in being an influence for Christ is to do positive good. Good that is not called forth by a stimulus that's outside of us, but it's good that we initiate. We go out of our way to do things that are good. In fact, it may be a matter of doing good in response to evil. Bless those that curse you type of thing, or give to him your cloak also, or the going the second mile sort of a principle. This is what grace is. This is the way God has acted toward us. He's not just responded in kind, but he's done good in return for our lack of good. We can initiate good for other people. we might say, donate ourselves. Especially in this initiation, we can look for a couple things I want to emphasize here. One is to look for an opportunity to be there in times of change. Those who've analyzed conversion processes have seen that conversions happen most when people are in the process of change, when their lives are being affected by factors beyond their control. In the loss of a loved one, perhaps. Maybe the loss of a job. Maybe simply the changing of jobs. Maybe it's a matter of moving to a new community. Maybe it's a matter of having a financial setback. At certain ages in life, our kids grow up and they leave home, and we have a new feel for life. It's these big changes in life that brings an opportunity for the gospel, because people have to reorganize their lives now. They have to reintegrate the pieces that are left. And when they do that, they have to look again at the whole of which life is made. And here is the natural opportunity then for us to give people the whole picture, the worldview that we call the Christian faith. Another thing, of course, is to be there in time of need. People always have needs coming up. Sometimes we have to wait for those opportunities, but inasmuch as we don't take care of all of the things ourselves, we can be looking for things to come our way and therefore come the way of other people, and to say, well, we'll be there and try to help them when needs occur. And the response to that then will be favorable toward the kind of person who demonstrates a life these kinds of people would like to have. Doing more than others is an expression Jesus uses in the last part of Matthew chapter 5, when he calls upon us not just to salute our brethren or to be good to those who've been good to us first, but we need to go beyond all of that, initiate good, respond in good ways to those that are not maybe treating us so well. And in doing that, we will glorify God and be moving toward the sort of perfection that he's called upon us and them to do. And we will be influencing for Christ in that sort of a way. Letting other people help us may also be another alternative. Jesus demonstrates this at the well of Sychar with the woman who come out there. He asked her to help him. Sometimes we can do that as well. It gives people the understanding that we can appreciate what they can contribute to our lives, and the result of that, our greater appreciation for them helps them appreciate us. The whole goal in all of this is not that God will be blasphemed because of us, but in fact God will be glorified because of the way we live. Now, so far we've been talking just about lifestyle evangelism, demonstration evangelism, presence evangelism, it's often called. And that is a terribly important thing. In my estimation, the rest of what we call evangelism cannot occur and will not have permanent fruit if this is not present. However, this is not the whole story. It does win for you, let's say, the right to speak to people about big questions in life. And in that way, it really has something of the same value as miraculous authentication did in the New Testament for Jesus and the apostles and others. It gave them a mark of credibility. All of us can have credibility based upon the way we live. But our living, the Christian life in itself, will not accomplish the evangelism process and will not extend the influence for Christ that we really want. It prepares the ground, but we have to do more than remove detractors and do positive good. We have to explain why. That is, why we live the way we do. People can't just look at our actions and tell that. They don't know why we act the way we do. Furthermore, in looking at our even good lives, they may not be able to see that there are needs of salvation in their own life simply because we are living in a Christian way ourselves. And so we can do anybody can do these kinds of things. We can testify as to what Christ means to us. We can describe what he has done for us. And that may require some stopping and thinking on our part to understand what in fact that has done, that has been. We need to get to the point where we can describe what Christianity is. We need to know the message. We need to understand the idea that The gospel itself has its own power, and though we may not be able to defend it terribly well, we might think, the very fact that we can explain it to someone will have a power in itself, because the message is designed for people who have needs. And it's not our responsibility to make the message stand up. It has its own inherent power. It is our responsibility to let people see that so they can make the applications for themselves. We need to be ready to give an answer for the hope that is within us. Sometimes that's a matter of preparation ahead of time, the matter of redeeming the times. Sometimes we have to wait for the opportunities to come to speak a good word for Christ. But when they are there, and when they do come, then we need to be ready to give those explanations and those statements. The fourth thing that we can mention is make special efforts. Above and beyond explaining what people might ask us about, we can take the initiative ourselves in evangelism, and this is often done, and we talk a lot about it, and there are books that can be bought about all of that. Most of us don't conceive of ourselves as being involved constantly in this sort of thing, but all of us can make special efforts in regard to our families, our children, our spouses, those who work with us and those who are our neighbors, people who are not Christian with whom we are in constant association. This is the kind of a thing that we mean then by influencing for Christ and accomplishing in the world on the basis of Christian demonstration the thing that we are calling upon everybody to do. And the good thing about that is this. When we aim at the goal of trying to influence other people for Christ, if we remember that our own lives have to measure up to standard, that goal of witnessing to others helps us live a better quality of life ourselves. The other way around, when we are trying to live the better quality of life, it has the effect of influencing others for Christ. And so it is that I think we see this interaction between ourselves and other people fitting in with the overall understanding of our station in the world. We are under God, and we are in relationship to other people, and it is our responsibility to influence others